December 20th, 1943. A B-17 Flying Fortress, called Lucky Strike, dragged itself across the English Channel like a hurt animal that didn't want to die. The number 3 engine was gone. Not just dead, completely gone. It was ripped off by flak over Bremen, leaving a huge hole in the wing. Hydraulic fluid left red streaks along the plane's body. The ball turret hung at a sick angle, its gunner already gone. By every rule, every manual, every physics calculation the Army Air Forces had made, this bomber should have crashed into the North Sea 20 minutes ago. But it didn't. Pilot Lieutenant Marcus Webb kept that damaged plane flying, using a mix of raw strength, prayer, and something else. Something the ground crew had done to his plane 3 weeks before that wasn't in any manual. When Lucky Strike finally touched down at RAF Bassingbourn, it did so on just one landing gear leg. Because the other would not come down, technically, there was no hydraulic pressure left to make it work. Webb skidded that plane down the runway in a shower of sparks that could be seen from the control tower a mile away. The crash crews thought they would pull out bodies. Instead, they found 8 men climbing out by themselves, shaken but alive. The 9th, the ball turret gunner, had been lost over the target, but everyone else made it home, even though the plane had, according to post-flight checks, lost its main hydraulic system, had terrible fuel system damage, and electrical failures that should have made controlled flying impossible. Group Commander Colonel James Albertson stood on the runway staring at the wreck and asked the only question that mattered: how? The official answer would take months. The real answer was already working in a hangar 200 yards away, hands deep in another B-17's engine cowling, making changes that could have gotten him court-martialed if anyone had written down what he was really doing. See, the Army Air Forces in late 1943 had a problem they couldn't clearly explain in their reports. Bombers were going down. That was normal. This was a war over Nazi Germany after all, and the Luftwaffe wasn't giving out participation prizes. But planes were falling from damage that should not have been deadly. One flak hit in the wrong spot, and a B-17 that could supposedly take punishment, that would destroy 3 fighters, would just drop out of formation. Something was wrong with the design, but Boeing wasn't going to say it. The Pentagon didn't want to hear it, and crews were dying because of it. Lucky Strike's survival wasn't luck. It was proof that someone had found the flaw and fixed it, using methods that would make procurement officers furious. This is the story of how one mechanic's secret modifications changed the B-17. From a statistical death sentence on certain missions, the B-17 turned into the legendary survivor we remember today. And it all started with a man who learned to fix things, not in any technical school, but in a garage during the Great Depression in Pittsburgh, where the rule was simple: make it work or it doesn't get fixed. Staff Sergeant Paul Zook wasn't supposed to be fixing airplanes. His Army Air Force personnel file said he had scored high enough on mechanical tests to be sent to the motor pool, working on trucks, jeeps, and the unglamorous machines that kept an airbase running. But someone in the assignment office at Bassingbourn saw his civilian work history and made a move that probably saved 100 lives. Before the war, Zook had run a repair shop in Pittsburgh's Polish Hill neighborhood, keeping coal trucks, delivery vans, and the occasional bootlegger's souped-up Ford running, all on budgets that would make the poverty line look generous. He arrived at Bassingbourn in August 1943, 26 years old, with grease already under his fingernails and an attitude about rules that his commanders would find both frustrating and invaluable. In his first week on the flight line, he watched a crew chief reject a B-17 for a cracked hydraulic line. Standard procedure by the book, completely correct according to Technical Order 012EG2. The replacement part was on back order and the plane sat grounded. The mission went out 1 bomber short. Zook asked why they couldn't bypass the broken part and reroute through a secondary line. The crew chief looked at him like he had suggested using baling wire to fix the wings. "That's not in the manual, Sergeant." Zook's reply, delivered in a Pittsburgh accent thick enough to cut with a wrench, became famous in the maintenance section. The manual didn't grow up fixing trucks during the Depression. I did. Here's what made Zuck different from mechanics trained in Army technical schools. Those guys could follow a technical order perfectly, fix planes exactly like Boeing said, and keep a B-17 at factory specifications. Zuck could look at a system that was failing and ask a question the engineers hadn't thought of. What happens if this breaks over Germany and there's no parts depot at 20,000 feet? His genius wasn't in knowing how things were supposed to work. It was in knowing how they could still work when everything went wrong. By October, other mechanics started noticing that planes Zook worked on had a strange habit of returning from missions they shouldn't have survived. A bomber he fixed took flak through the hydraulic bay. It should have lost all landing gear control, but the pilot landed safely. Another plane lost primary electrical power after a fighter attack, yet the instruments worked long enough to bring the navigator home. Coincidence, the crew chief said. Lucky coincidence. Zook didn't believe in luck. He believed in having backups, in having extra systems, and in sending important functions through paths that were not in the Boeing plans. Because Boeing had never really thought about what happened when their neat, clean, single-point designs met German 88mm flak. While other mechanics replaced parts, Zook was redesigning systems right there on the spot, using scavenged pieces, borrowed tubing, and electrical connections that would have made an inspector cry. The other mechanics started calling him the plumber because he was always rerouting something: hydraulic lines, fuel feeds, electrical bundles, anything that needed help. He would spend hours after official duty time in the hangars, a flashlight in his teeth, rewiring planes in ways that never showed up in the maintenance logs, because technically what he was doing broke about 15 different Army rules. When people asked why he even bothered, when he could have just stayed in the motor pool drinking coffee and staying out of trouble, Zook gave a simple answer. Those guys fly the missions. The least I can do is make sure the plane doesn't kill them on the way home. The B-17 Flying Fortress was supposed to be impossible to destroy. Boeing's marketing almost promised it, and the early reports from 1942 seemed to support it. Fortresses came back from missions looking like flying cheese graters, with holes punched through their wings and bodies, yet they still flew. Crews called them flying fortresses for good reason. These planes could take damage that would turn a B-24 into dust. But by late 1943, a worrying pattern showed up in the loss reports that nobody liked talking about planes weren't just being shot down by big fighter attacks or direct flak hits to important parts. They were going down from single points of failure, one hit in the wrong place, and a bomber worth $200,000 and carrying 10 trained airmen would fall out of formation and vanish. The 8th Air Force was losing bombers at about 5% per mission by fall 1943. Do the math. A crew's chance of surviving the required 25-mission tour was basically a coin flip. Something was destroying B-17s that should not have killed them. And it took mechanics like Zook actually studying the wreckage up close to discover the real problem. Hydraulics. The B-17's hydraulic system controlled everything that mattered when you were trying not to die. Landing gear, brakes, wing flaps, and the turret systems that helped gunners track enemy fighters. Boeing had built an efficient system with the main lines running through the fuselage in neat bundles, because that makes sense when you design for peacetime efficiency. But efficient meant everything was concentrated. One piece of flak through the wrong 6 inches of fuselage and you lost hydraulic pressure to several systems at once. A bomber could have 3 good engines, safe wings, and a healthy crew. But without hydraulics, you could not lower the landing gear. And a B-17 doing a belly landing on an English runway was often a B-17 that burst into flames. Then there was the fuel system, which had its own dangerous way of killing people. The B-17 carried 2,780 gallons of high-octane fuel in 9 tanks, 5 in the wings, 4 in the fuselage. The fuel feed system was designed so fuel flowed from the outer wing tanks toward the inside tanks to keep the plane balanced. It was smart engineering, except the fuel lines between the tanks ran through spots that were directly in the path of fire when German fighters attacked from the side, at the 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock positions. A 20mm cannon round through a fuel line didn't only mean you lost fuel, though you did lose it in a huge, dangerous way. It also meant you now had aviation gas spraying inside the plane, where hot metal, electrical sparks, and freezing open air at around -40 degrees created the perfect setup for fire or vapor lock. Zook had noticed something in the engineering. Reports missed completely. Planes that went down for strange, unclear reasons often showed signs of fuel system problems before they crashed. Pilots said their engines ran rough, then one engine failed, then another, and then the whole plane would shake apart or catch fire. Post-crash reports, when anything was left to study, kept mentioning fuel contamination or air in the lines. What was really happening was simple once you looked closely. Flak or bullets would damage a fuel line. Air would enter the fuel system. Then engines would start dying one after another, because they were all fed by the same damaged network. And the bomber would crash. Not because it was too damaged to fly, but because it was basically choking itself to death. Boeing's engineers had built a plane that worked wonderfully when everything was perfect. But flying over Germany in 1943 was not perfect. It was a place where every system needed to expect damage and still keep working anyway. The B-17's real weak point wasn't armor or guns. It was the single point of failure design idea. And that was the thing Zook started fixing, one unauthorized change at a time. What Zook did wasn't technically illegal. It was actually worse. It was unauthorized field modification of combat aircraft systems, which meant that if a plane crashed and investigators found his work caused it, he would face a court-martial for negligent homicide. But Zook saw the math differently. If he did nothing, the planes crashed anyway. At least with his changes, they had a fighting chance. The heart of his secret fix was extremely simple. Make backups where Boeing had none. Take that hydraulic system with its neat, clean, single bundle design and turn it into a wild maze of backup lines that looked like a plumber's nightmare, but kept working when the main system was hit. Zook started collecting hydraulic tubing from damaged aircraft in the salvage yard, pieces that were supposed to go back for official recycling. He cut undamaged sections, tested them for pressure strength, using a hand pump he built himself, and then added them as bypass routes in active aircraft. Here's how it worked in real life. A standard B-17 had one main hydraulic line running from the pump to the landing gear actuators. Zook would tap into that line at 2 points, one forward near the cockpit, one aft near the radio room, and run a secondary line along a different path, usually tucked along the fuselage stringers where it was protected by structural members. Then he'd install manual isolation valves at each junction point, using parts cannibalized from damaged bombers. If the primary line took a hit and lost pressure, the pilot could reach down. Zook mounted the valves within arm's reach and manually switched to the backup line. It wasn't elegant. It added weight. It violated Technical Order Z0120EG 2, Section 4, Paragraph 12, Subsection C, and it meant the difference between landing on wheels or sliding down the runway on the belly and praying. The fuel system fix was even more radical. Zook couldn't prevent fuel lines from getting hit. That was a fact of flying through flak. But he could prevent a hit from cascading into complete system failure. He started installing crossover valves between tank systems using fuel petcocks designed for ground refueling operations. Officially, these valves were only supposed to be used on the ground. Zook installed them in flight accessible positions and documented them on maintenance forms as refueling system check valves. Technically true, deliberately vague. Now, when a fuel line took damage, pilots could isolate the compromised tank and reroute fuel flow from intact tanks directly to the engines that needed it. But the modification that really saved lives involved the electrical system. B-17S had a primary electrical bus that powered everything from instruments to turret motors. One hit to that bus and you were flying dark. No instruments, no radio, no gun turrets. Zook started running secondary power lines from the auxiliary generator directly to critical systems, bypassing the main bus entirely. He'd hide these lines inside existing cable bundles so they looked like factory wiring until you actually traced where they went. He used a different color of insulation, yellow instead of the standard black, so pilots would know which breakers controlled the emergency backup systems. The brilliance of Zock's approach was that he wasn't inventing new technology. Everything he used was already on the aircraft, or in the parts bins. He was just rearranging the puzzle pieces in ways Boeing's engineers hadn't considered, because they'd been optimizing for manufacturing efficiency, not combat survivability. A bomber coming off the Seattle production line in 1943 was built to be assembled, quickly by workers who'd been housewives 6 months earlier. Zook's modifications required a skilled mechanic who understood systems theory and wasn't afraid to deviate from the blueprint when the blueprint was getting people killed. By January 1944, Zook had quietly modified 17 B-17s in the 351st Bomb Group. He never advertised it, he never wrote it up, and he simply kept doing it because he knew these careful changes were saving brave crew members. He just did the work during night maintenance shifts when fewer officers were around to ask uncomfortable questions. And those 17 bombers were coming home from missions at a rate that was starting to look statistically impossible. February 8, 1944. Captain Ronald Fletcher, engineering officer for the 351st Bomb Group, was having a very bad morning that was about to get worse. He had been doing routine maintenance inspections, the kind where you randomly pull aircraft from the flight line and check that they match their technical documentation. When he opened the hydraulic access panel on a B-17 called Devil's Daughter, he found plumbing that absolutely should not exist. Fletcher wasn't stupid. He had been an aeronautical engineering student at MIT before the war, and he could read a blueprint. What he was looking at wasn't on any Boeing blueprint he had ever seen. Secondary hydraulic lines ran through non-standard routes. Manual isolation valves were installed in spots that needed custom brackets. Fuel crossover connections used parts from what seemed to be 3 different aircraft, and all of it was done with a level of craftsmanship that showed this was not some sloppy field fix. This was careful, thought-out modification. He found Zook in Hangar 3 working on an engine swap. "Sergeant, we need to talk about Devil's Daughter's hydraulic system." Zook didn't even look up from the cowling he was working on. "What about it?" Fletcher pulled out his inspection clipboard. "What about it? What about the fact that there are about 40 feet of unauthorized hydraulic line installed in non-standard routes with manually operated valves that aren't in the technical orders?" Zook put down his wrench, wiped his hands on a rag that was somehow dirtier than his hands, and gave Fletcher a look that was both tired and defiant. "You want the official answer or the real one?" Fletcher's response was immediate. "Both. Starting with how long you've been doing this and how many aircraft are affected." 17 planes. That number made Fletcher's blood pressure spike. 17 aircraft in active service with undocumented modifications to primary flight systems. The rules violation was huge. Zook could be court-martialed. Fletcher himself could face punishment for not catching it sooner. But then, Fletcher asked the question that changed everything. "Have any of these 17 aircraft had hydraulic failure?" Zook pulled out a grease-stained notebook from his coverall pocket, his personal maintenance log that wasn't part of any official record. 3 of them took flak hits to primary hydraulic lines. All 3 made it home using the backup system. Devil's Daughter landed on her own gear 2 weeks ago after an 80mm shell took out her primary line over Frankfurt. The pilot didn't even know he was on the backup until I showed him the damage after the flight. Fletcher did the math in his head. 3 catastrophic hydraulic hits, 0 losses. The standard statistics said at least 2 of those planes should have been written off. By noon, Fletcher had escalated the issue to Group Commander Albertson, the same colonel who had watched Lucky Strike's miraculous landing back in December. By 2 p.m., Albertson was in the hangar personally inspecting Zook's modifications with Fletcher, giving the technical explanation. And by 4 p.m., a very uncomfortable meeting was happening in the Group Operations Office, where the question on the table was whether to court-martial Zook or give him a medal. Major Henry Watkins from the 8th Air Force engineering staff arrived on February 10th to conduct a formal investigation. He spent 3 days crawling through Zook's modified aircraft, taking photographs of the installations, reviewing maintenance logs, and interviewing pilots. His preliminary report, filed February 13th, included a paragraph that probably took him an hour to write, because it basically admitted the Army Air Forces had been sending crews into combat with aircraft that were vulnerable in ways that could have been prevented. While SSGT Zoc's modifications are unauthorized and violate standing technical orders, preliminary analysis suggests these changes address systemic vulnerability in hydraulic and fuel system design that may contribute to combat losses. Recommend against punitive action pending engineering, evaluation and controlled testing. That paragraph saved Zook's career, but it also opened a door nobody in the Pentagon wanted opened. A door that led to questions about how many crews had died because Boeing's design put production efficiency above combat survivability. Albertson made a command decision that probably bent a few rules himself. Zook wouldn't face charges, but he also couldn't modify any more aircraft until the engineering evaluation was complete. In the meantime, those 17 bombers would keep flying missions because even the top brass could read the survival statistics. Major Watkins returned to Bassingbourn on March 3, 1944, with 2 Boeing engineers, a team of Army Air Force technical specialists, and a mandate that basically said, "Prove this works or prove it's dangerous, but do it fast because we are losing bombers over Germany." What followed was the most informal, high-stakes engineering test in military aviation history. They were testing unauthorized field modifications under real combat conditions while trying to figure out if this should be documented as innovation or as evidence in a court-martial. The Boeing engineers, both civilians under military contract, were shocked at first sight. The lead engineer, a man named Carlson, who had worked on the original B-17 design in Seattle, spent his first hour at Bassingbourn using words like contamination risk, pressure regulation concerns, and potential catastrophic failure modes. He stood in front of a partially taken apart bomber, pointing at Zook's bypass lines, explaining to Watkins why this couldn't possibly work because it broke fundamental hydraulic system design rules made by people with engineering degrees. Zook, standing there in grease-stained coveralls, let him finish, then asked a question. "When's the last time you flew a combat mission?" Carlson bristled. "I'm an engineer, not a pilot." Zook nodded. "Right. So, you designed this system in Seattle where the worst thing that happens is a failed pressure test. I maintain these birds when they come back with holes in them. Different perspective." What Watkins suggested was radical. Instrument some of Zook's modified aircraft with extra pressure gauges, flow meters, and monitoring equipment. Then send them on real combat missions while recording system performance. In any normal procurement process, this would take months of ground testing first. But this was March 1944. The air war over Germany was at its peak, and the 8th Air Force was losing an average of 6 bombers per mission. They didn't have months. Between March 5th and March 18th, 5 of Zook's modified B-17S flew a total of 11 combat missions to targets including Berlin, Brunswick, and Friedrichshafen. Each aircraft carried extra instruments that recorded hydraulic pressure, fuel flow, and electrical system performance during the whole mission. 3 of those bombers took battle damage. All 5 came home. The data was clear and undeniable. On the mission to Friedrichshafen on March 18th, a bomber called Memphis Belle II, one of Zook's modified planes, took an 80mm flak burst that shredded the primary hydraulic line exactly where Boeing's design had it running along the bomb bay. The instruments recorded primary system pressure dropping to 0 in 4.2 seconds, standard procedure. The plane should have been unable to control landing gear, flaps, or brakes. But Memphis Belle II's pilot, following briefing instructions Zook had personally given him, reached down and turned 3 manual isolation valves. The backup system kicked in. Pressure stabilized at 85% of normal, lower than ideal, but still enough to operate. The bomber stayed in formation, completed its bomb run, and landed at Bassingbourn on its own gear, while engineers on the ground watched their monitoring equipment and realized they were seeing something impossible. A hydraulic system that survived a catastrophic failure. Carlson, the Boeing engineer, watched the data playback in stunned silence. Finally, he turned to Watkins and said something that probably hurt to admit. "This shouldn't work. The pressure dynamics are all wrong. The flow rates are too low, And there's no proper filtration in the bypass system, but it does work. I don't understand why, but it works. Zook, standing in the back of the briefing room, offered an explanation that probably didn't make it into the official report. It works because I designed it to work when everything's already gone to hell. Your system works great until it doesn't. Mine works badly all the time, but it keeps working. The testing phase produced 47 pages of technical data, 11 mission after-action reports, and a conclusion that Air Force engineering couldn't ignore Zook's modifications. Increased system survivability without hurting primary system function. Translation: he had made the plane safer without making it worse. On March 22nd, Watkins filed his final report with a recommendation that would affect every B-17 squadron in England. Authorize field modification based on Zook's design, and start training mechanics across all 8th Air Force groups. In April 1944, while the Pentagon argued about official procurement channels and Boeing negotiated retrofit contracts that wouldn't be ready until June at the earliest, something else was happening on airfields across East Anglia. Mechanics were talking to each other. And when mechanics talk, they don't talk about policy. They talk about what works. Staff Sergeant Mike Delacroix from the 300th Bomb Group at Molesworth had heard about Zook's modifications through a crew chief who had transferred from Bassingbourn. By April 8th, Delacroix was at Bassingbourn during a supply run, notebook in hand, asking Zook to show him the hydraulic bypass installation. Zook spent 3 hours showing him every connection point, every valve placement, every routing choice. Delacroix went back to Molesworth and started modifying aircraft that night. Within a week, the 300th had 5 bombers running Zook's system. Technical Sergeant James Wu at Thorpe Abbotts heard about it from Delacroix. By April 15th, the 100th Bomb Group, the Bloody 100th, which had the worst loss rate in the 8th Air Force, had mechanics working double shifts to install bypass systems on every operational aircraft. They didn't wait for authorization. They didn't file modification requests. They just did it because they had watched too many bombers go down from damage that should have been survivable. This was a grassroots engineering revolution spreading through informal networks while official channels debated committees. Master Sergeant Robert Chen at Kimbolton started keeping statistics that the Air Force wasn't tracking yet. In March, before any modifications, the 379th Bomb Group had a 14% abort rate from mechanical failures during missions. By late April, with 12 aircraft running Zook's modifications, that rate dropped to 6%. Chen's logbook, unofficial and unrecognized, showed something even more striking. Modified aircraft that took battle damage were 3 times more likely to return to base than unmodified planes taking similar damage. The official authorization came through on April 28, 1944, as Technical Order 0120EG 2127. Field modification for enhanced hydraulic system redundancy in B-17F and B-17G aircraft. It was 6 pages of bureaucratic language that basically said mechanics could now legally do what dozens of them were already doing. But the technical order was careful and limited. It allowed the hydraulic modifications, but didn't mention Zook's fuel system crossovers or electrical bypasses because Boeing still said those were unnecessary and could be dangerous. Zook read the technical order and laughed. Not a happy laugh, but the bitter laugh of a man who had watched bureaucracy almost court-martial him for saving lives, and was now watching the same bureaucracy take credit while only doing half the fix. He went back to installing fuel crossovers on the night shift, still unauthorized, because the paper from headquarters didn't change the fact that B-17S was still going down from fuel system failures. By May 1944, the modification had spread to about 120 aircraft across 7 different bomb groups. The official number of aircraft modified under the new technical order was 41. That gap between official and actual showed mechanics who looked at the rules, looked at the planes, and made the same choice. Zook had made better to beg forgiveness than ask permission when lives were at risk. The survival statistics began showing results the Air Force couldn't ignore. The 341st Bomb Group, Zook's home unit, where almost every operational B-17 now had the full set of modifications, including the unauthorized fuel and electrical work, had a loss rate of 2.1% in May 1944. The 8th Air Force average was 3.8%. That might not sound like much, but across a month of operations involving thousands of bomber sorties, it meant dozens of crews came home instead of being listed as missing in action. Colonel Albertson, in a moment of either brilliance or career suicide, invited an 8th Air Force statistical analysis team to Bassingbourn in early June to review the group's survival data. He showed them everything: the official modifications, the unofficial ones, and the numbers. The analysis team's report, filed June 9th, had a sentence that confirmed what every mechanic on the flight line already knew. Statistical correlation between modified aircraft and improved survivability is significant beyond normal variance and warrants expanded implementation. The revolution had become policy, Zook had become a model. And across England, mechanics were still doing unauthorized modifications after hours, because the official policy hadn't caught up to the full fix yet. They were all Zook now. Every sergeant with a wrench who looked at a regulation and decided that bringing crews home mattered more than following the manual. August 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 3 months later. A statistician at Air Force headquarters named Captain Dorothy Henshaw compiled a report that would never be widely published, but told the story in numbers that couldn't be argued with. She had taken mission data from every B-17 group in the 8th Air Force, cross-checked it with maintenance logs showing which aircraft had received Zook's modifications, both official and the unofficial ones that mechanics had carefully recorded after the fact, and ran correlation analysis that would have made her statistics professors proud. Groups with 75% or higher adoption of the full modification package, hydraulic, fuel, and electrical, showed a 23.4% improvement in aircraft return rates compared to their pre-modification baseline. That number meant 347 bombers made it home instead of going down over Germany or the North Sea. Multiply by 10 crew members per aircraft. Factor in that some crews survived even when aircraft were lost. And Zook's forbidden fix had saved somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 airmen who would have otherwise been killed, captured, or listed as missing. But the number that really mattered was buried in Henshaw's appendix data. Aircraft with the complete Zook modification package that sustained Category 3 damage, defined as damage needing major repair or system replacement, returned to base 81% of the time. Unmodified aircraft with the same damage returned 47% of the time. The modification hadn't made B-17 invincible, but it had turned survivable damage into real survival, instead of statistical loss. Paul Zook left the Army Air Forces in November 1945 with the rank of Technical Sergeant, an Army Commendation Medal for exceptional technical skill in aircraft maintenance, and no mention anywhere in his official record of the field modifications that had defined his contribution to the war. He went back to Pittsburgh, reopened his repair shop in Polish Hill, and spent the next 30 years fixing cars, trucks, and the occasional airplane owned by a local flying club. He never talked much about the war. In 1973, a researcher named Dr. Michael Torres from the Air Force Historical Research Agency tracked Zook down while working on a study of wartime field modifications. Torres spent 3 days in Pittsburgh interviewing Zook and reviewing the personal maintenance logs Zook had kept. The grease-stained notebooks that had never made it into official records. Torres asked the question that probably should have been asked 30 years earlier. Why had Zook risked court-martial to make unauthorized modifications? Zook's answer, recorded in Torres's interview notes, was characteristically blunt. It didn't seem that risky to me. Guys were dying because the planes weren't built right. I could fix that, or I could follow the manual. Seemed like an easy choice. The B-17 that Zook had first modified, Lucky Strike, the bomber that started everything in December 1943, survived the war and was eventually scrapped in 1954. But photographs of its hydraulic bay taken during the 1944 engineering evaluation ended up in Air Force maintenance training manuals used into the 1960s. The captions never mentioned Zook by name, referring only to field-developed redundancy modifications. Generations of aircraft mechanics learned from his work without ever knowing who had done it. Boeing eventually added parts of Zook's modifications into the B-17G production run, starting in late 1944, though the official documents credited the changes to ongoing engineering refinement, rather than admitting they were using field fixes developed by a sergeant with only a high school education who had learned engineering by keeping Depression-era trucks running. The post-war B-29 and B-50 bomber programs included redundant hydraulic and fuel systems as standard design features. Lessons learned in Blood over Germany and applied by engineers who reviewed the wartime modification data. Paul Zook died in 1989 at age 72. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette made no mention of B-17s or the war, noting only that he was a veteran and had run Zook's auto repair for 4 decades. His personal maintenance logs, the unofficial record of every aircraft he had modified, were donated to the Air Force Museum in Dayton after his death. They sit in the research archives now, available to anyone who requests them. 47 notebooks filled with technical sketches, pressure calculations done in the margins, and annotations in a mechanic's shorthand that tell the real story of how one man's refusal to follow the manual changed the odds for thousands of airmen who never knew his name. The forbidden trick became standard practice. The Maverick became a model. And the lesson that sometimes the people closest to the problem see solutions that engineers in distant offices miss remains relevant every time someone has to choose between the manual and what actually works when lives are on the line.